The name Paracelsus has just become synonymous with the esoteric renaissance and revolution at the very heart of early modernity. So much so that both he and Agrippa both got name dropped in the recent Robert Eggers film Nosferatu as somehow even metonymizing occult knowledge itself. But, like Agrippa, Paracelsus is more known as a name than his works are actually known in detail. And to be sure, there's a good reason for that. His works are vast and they are filled with strange neologisms. They're inaccessible in terms of language, and they often read much more like an unhinged rant than systematic treatise. I mean, here's a copy of Paracelsus's complete works from 1603 in the original German edition, just to give you some sense of how chunky, that's a technical term, just how huge his writings are. So you get a sense of, here it is on the spine, Theophrastus Paracelsi, this nice tooled, pig-skinned edition, and it's just enormous flipping through this volume that you can open up, and I'm here just about halfway through it, maybe a little more, and it's still page 930. This volume is just enormous, and this is the reason why Paracelsus has the reputation that he has, because it is just so much text. But after introducing the fundamentals of his philosophy in the Paragranum, and then going on to the more fundamentals of his alchemical medical theory in the first episode of the Paramirum, I now want to turn to what I consider to be some of his most radical writing ever, even shocking in the early text. And for Paracelsus, I have to say that's really saying something. He says positively shocking things all the time. But his final book of the Paramirum on the invisible diseases and their causes details how the metaphysical and supernatural world can induce illness, and further, how such disease can be combated with similar means, including, by the way, the use of magic, even magic typically thought of as forbidden necromancy, including the conjuration of spirits. Here we find Paracelsus bridging the gap between medicine, alchemy, and magic, and the kind of text that would forever link him with the world of the occult. Let's explore this strange, often bewildering work together. Make sure to subscribe here for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support this kind of work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon, or maybe consider buying some of the merch we have here available on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism, make sure to check out my study guide, which gives you sort of the lay of the land and the reliable texts to orient you to the topic. And if you're interested in historical books of magic, like this big, enormous volume of Paracelsus, which I'll have the first volume of this available in our new spring catalog, make sure to check out my rare bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the unity of alchemy, magic, and medicine in the revolutionary work of Theophrastus Bombastus Paracelsus. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, known on the streets as Paracelsus, was a radical firebrand and reformer, specifically in the realms of alchemy and its application to medicine. Infamous for publicly burning the standard medical textbooks of his day in the Faculty of Medicine, which promptly got him fired, unsurprisingly, he rightly earned a reputation of being as cantankerous as he was obscure. But his rejection of accepting ancient authority just on its face also inspired a generation to take up his campaign, one that would lay the groundwork for modern toxicology, pharmacology, and put an end to centuries of mistaken humoral theories developed by Galen and Avicenna. The 1520s would see Paracelsus pioneer a new radical theory of alchemy, novel theories for the origins of disease and their treatment, and an anti-establishment mentality that can basically only be described as 16th century alchemical punk rock. However, Paracelsus was neither a medieval nor really a modern thinker, but a kind of hinge between the two. Thus, his theories of pharmacology strike the ear as far more modern than medieval, but his embrace of using sigil magic to combat spiritual disease inflicted by the forces of Satan, well, that's pretty medieval. But such a hinge, liminal figure are key. He's key for his Janus-like ability to look forwards and backwards at once, and Paracelsus, without any doubt, was just such a figure. Now, I've covered the foundations of the Paracelsian Revolution in my episode on the Paragramum. The damn book is called Against the Grain, where Paracelsus sets out his revolutionary agenda at the level of theory. That is to say, specifically on the topics of philosophy, astronomy, astrology, alchemy, and proprietas, or virtue. There we see Paracelsus as more like a wrecking ball, lashing out at the academic and medical establishments of his day, destroying what he takes to be a corrupt and basically foolish system that does more damage than good. And then he lays out in skeletal detail what would eventually become his constantly evolving philosophy. A bit later, of course, Paracelsus would then publish his Paramirum, Greater Than Miracles. Humility was never a real virtue of Paracelsus, where there he began to lay out his positive platform for reform of medicine along alchemical lines. Now, I've covered the first section of that text, the Paramirum, wherein Paracelsus marries the Hermetic theory of the unity of macrocosm and microcosm with his theory of the Tartar origin of disease to detail the etiology and treatment of human illness already. I'll have a link to that episode if you want to check it out. But in this episode, I want to jump slightly ahead to Paracelsus's treatment of metaphysical and supernatural illnesses and their treatments, a topic that marries not only Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, and medicine, but also the use of magic and some of the frankly more shocking elements of this text. For now, I'm going to be skipping over the chapter on the matrix. This is a text that deals in specific issues in women's health, especially pregnancy, because I want to cover that topic in a future episode where I compare and contrast Paracelsus's attitude to the more standard medieval handbook on women's health, the De Secretis Mulieribus, attributed falsely to Albertus Magnus. So look for that episode in the near future. But that Paracelsus would contend with metaphysical or supernatural dimensions of illness is just the logical conclusion for the Paramirum for several reasons. The first is that the traditional Galenic humoral medicine theory, this is the theory of the four humors inside the body, didn't really deal with issues of supernatural illness at all, something very much a widespread belief of the context of 16th century Europe and medieval Europe more generally. Think of the widespread belief, for instance, in something like demonic possession as a ground for illness, especially something like epilepsy. Secondly, Paracelsus's generation was witness to novel diseases that no one had ever seen before, specifically the arrival of the French disease, probably something like syphilis. And the older humoral theory lacked much in the way of explaining novel diseases. Next, Paracelsus took seriously that illnesses could have metaphysical origins and treatments, especially as what we might now refer to as folk medicine. Recall that Paracelsus was radical in that he actually listened to workers and peasants and miners and women to learn from their lived experience rather than just what a bunch of ancient textbooks authorities said. Such folk beliefs were widespread, and from Paracelsus's point of view, were very much worth taking seriously and incorporating into any theory of medicine, especially his driving medical revolution. Finally, the notion that the total human being was composed of both a body and a soul, and soul here would also be inclusive of what we also think of as the mind, such that the soul could be impacted and have an impact on the body, was just obvious to everyone at that time, at this time no less. That the Galenic humoral theory didn't center the spiritual dimension of health, sickness, and treatment was for Paracelsus a glaring omission that needed to be corrected. And so, for all of these reasons, Paracelsus decides to conclude the Paramirum with a specific look at supernatural and metaphysical disease. But thus, having established his theory of the specific physical, that is to say, the visible and corporeal microcosm as he has it, the specifically physical dimensions of illness and their treatments, Paracelsus logically turns to the supernatural or metaphysical dimension of that topic in Book 5 of the Paramirum, though in many ways this book stands on its own as well. Thus, in this text he treats of the topic of Glaube, or faith or belief, hidden celestial impressions, which unfortunately chapter 2 is just missing from the text for some reason, the power of the imagination, the power of Mummia, which we'll come back to, and the use of magical sigils and the conjuration of spirits. Paracelsus reasons that reality is composed of two dimensions, one visible and corporeal, populated by physical bodies, and another invisible and incorporeal, populated by souls, spirits, angels, demons, God, stuff like that. Indeed, the invisible realm is far more vast, more powerful, and more enduring than the physical world, and thus we shouldn't be surprised that it would have a sustained and dramatic effect upon our physical world and our physical bodies and their health. Further, our own interior world, the world of what we would now call the mind, or perhaps now the domain of psychology, also has an impact on us as well, from something like melancholy, what we might now call mental illness, to the ability of the mind to otherwise impact our health. It's just rather clear for Paracelsus that such a discussion of the reality of the incorporeal, the invisible dimension of medicine, just has to be dealt with for any sustained totalizing medical theory. And again, we see Paracelsus as this kind of hinge figure. His discussion of demons and spirits might strike us as a bit medieval in character, but his discussion of the reality of the impact of mental and emotional states upon physical health, well, that seems perfectly modern, even postmodern in some ways. Thus, at the core of the question is the means by which we perceive, interact with, and impact the metaphysical world, and for Paracelsus, that is via Glaube. Now, this is best understood as belief, but specifically religious belief, or a kind of religious faith, an intense religious faith, along with the faculty of the imagination. Specifically, Paracelsus leans on that famous scriptural tenet from Matthew 17, that faith even the size of a tiny mustard seed has the ability to move mountains. Thus, metaphysical faith or belief has the ability not only to interact with corporeal reality, but to do so with tremendous impact. Specifically, faith has the power to directly heal physical maladies, just in the ways described in the Gospels, whereby Jesus would often announce that not I, but your faith has healed you. But how? Paracelsus argues that the natural state of the human being is healthy, and that such health is actually born of divine mercy. God wants us to be happy and healthy. However, sin and the general fallenness of our world induce sickness. But our inner faith is not merely belief in the sense that one might believe in this or that tenet of a religion or a belief system. Rather, for Paracelsus, faith is a way of being, an interior comportment of the soul, whereby the alienation of the human soul from the divine is bridged, such that the divine mercy flows down upon us, healing both our body and our soul via salvation and the body via medical cures. Recall that the word salvation just literally means to heal. While the doctor can treat symptoms and correct diet and provide some degree of rejuvenation, it's ultimately faith, Glaube, and divine mercy which ultimately heal us for Paracelsus, both spiritually and physically. But just as faith can be directed to the divine, it can also be directed in various mundane and even malevolent directions as well. Recall that James 2 informs us that even the demons believe, or even the demons have faith, and shudder. Thus, misdirected or malign faith can also induce illness, both us acting upon ourselves, but also via direct demonic influence. faith as a kind of strong belief or actively willed belief can transform reality around us. A bit like the contemporary concept of manifesting, although I think we should hold that stuff at arm's length. But this is to say that sufficient faith in something has the ability to alter physical reality around us to some degree. Indeed, demons and spirits, for instance, since they don't have physical bodies, can actually only transform reality through that means, via their strong belief, their faith. Further, one's own faith in a given state of affairs has the ability to especially shift one's inner reality or health, for both weal and for woe. Specifically, Paracelsus weighs into the religious debates of his time about the power of the saints to both inflict illness and to cure. His argument is that the saints have no such powers and that pilgrimages to them and veneration of things like statues of saints especially is much more likely to result in a misplaced faith than anything else. Indeed, he likens people's beliefs in such ability of statues to heal as tantamount to basically paganism, St. James just having taken the place of some god like Apollo. Again, it's one's faith and divine mercy, not some saint, much less a wooden statue of some saint, that has healing powers. Further, he also rejects that the saints can induce illness upon people. One of the more curious beliefs of the Middle Ages, as you may know, is that because many saints were tormented by people during their lifetime, that the saints after their lifetime would afflict humankind with various kinds of illnesses as basically payback. Saint Valentine causing something like seizures, Saint Cyril and John causing skin ulcers, Saint Anthony causing shingles and ergotism. Paracelsus rejects that the saints cause such conditions. Rather, for him, they emerge from a range of apparent and occult causes. Even the infamous dancing plague of 1518, dancing plague of 1518, that's going to get an episode, began for him with just a disgruntled wife feigning an illness until it actually took hold inside of her. Not only her, but hundreds of others, dancing some allegedly to death. Through powerful belief, what began for Paracelsus as a mere acting out grew into an actual illness, something that we might now term mass hysteria. Indeed, it's the power of such faith that is the ground for novel diseases in general to develop. And here Paracelsus mentions the French disease, probably something like syphilis, something the humoral theories struggle to explain, much less treat. And indeed, Paracelsus had a lot to say about the treatment of syphilis. Finally, such misplaced faith can also induce people to what he would call enthusiasm, a kind of mania whereby clear thought and faith were overruled by misplaced faith and emotion, such that people basically behaved insanely. Again, Paracelsus wades into the religious controversies of his day to chide the bizarre faith of the Anabaptists, who are gladly burned alive over their faith in the necessity of adult baptism for some reason for the accomplishment of salvation. This just strikes Paracelsus as utterly beyond the pale, insanity masquerading as true religious fervor. But how do we know how to correctly place our faith? That virtue is known as discernment, by which Christ alone is the North Star of faith, and thus not faith in ourselves, saints, or anything else, which will ultimately leads to delusion and indeed to physical and spiritual sickness for Paracelsus. Unfortunately, Book 2 on celestial causation is just missing. Either Paracelsus didn't write it or it was somehow lost before the works went to print in manuscripts. We don't know. It's just not there. Of course, celestial causation was of a special interest for astrology, and virtually everyone had some opinion on this matter back in the day. Indeed, the topic is treated at length in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. However, given just how, let's call it idiosyncratic Paracelsus was, I suspect that we should be very slow to ascribe any specific beliefs around celestial causation to him here. However, his other cosmological writings do survive, and I'm sure that I'll link back to this subject when I get to those in a future episode. So I'm sure we're going to get to celestial causation at some point soon. The 3rd book of the Paramirum concerns another important topic of great interest during the Renaissance, the role of the imagination as a bridge between the purely invisible spirit and the physical body, especially as a means and medium by which the latter acts upon the former. Specifically, we have to recall this is a pre-Descartes, pre-Cartesian conception of the faculty of the imagination. But since the mid-17th century, the imagination has largely been conceived as part of the mind that basically generates mental images, specifically images of things that just don't have extra mental existence. That is to say, things that don't really exist. So say if you want a unicorn, you can just imagine a white horse and a horn and stick that horn on there and poof, your imagination has generated an image of a unicorn. And while pre-modern conceptions of this idea of the imagination also held that the faculty performed just those kinds of tasks, it was also thought of as the imagination as a kind of organ of perception, but also of impression. Things could impress themselves upon the imagination. Thus, Paracelsus held that the imagination had the ability to press itself upon our emotional, libidinal, and physical lives. Specifically, his concern is how the imagination of a pregnant person can impress imaginary aspects upon the developing fetus. In the way that a carpenter first imagines a house in their mind and then impresses their imagination onto wood and nails, thus generating a house, so too can an expecting mother impress the contents of their imagination upon the clay of the fetus, thus shaping its development. This is how, according to Paracelsus, the qualities of that child emerge, the psychological properties of that child, the personality of that child. Thus, a mother who strongly imagines stealing, for instance, while pregnant will induce a quality of thievishness upon her child. And while such traits are usually associated with astral influence, Paracelsus locates them much more specifically with the imaginative impressions of the mother. Indeed, he ascribes the births of what he calls monsters. This is following Aristotle's theories of monsterdom. These are children or animals born with physical or mental difference, disabilities, or deformities. Again, this is pretty pre-modern stuff, to the power of the mother's imagination. But Paracelsus goes much further than this. Just as a fetus is forged in the menstruum of the mother, the world is forged as the menstruum of the human being, and thus our imagination has power, direct power, to alter the world. Thus, the human imagination has the ability of indirectly affecting the world by informing physical action, again, imagining and then building a literal house, but also through directly altering the world through supernatural means via direct power of the imagination. The art of transforming the world directly via the imagination, or with the Olympian spirits of creation, Paracelsus denotes as Kabbalah, although he spells it with a G. Kabbalah, for some reason. The power of the stars within the human being is then just passed over in silence. So thanks for that, Paracelsus, being a big tease and not telling us how to do this. However, we will come back to this in the form of magic, because magic and Kabbalah for Paracelsus are basically the same thing, and he's going to give us a bit more of a sense, perhaps, of how all that Kabbalistic alteration of the world through the imagination is actually accomplished. Finally, Paracelsus informs us that especially powerful sexual desire, especially unnaturally sated sexual desire, can produce the demonic succubus and incubus. Here, the power of the libidinal imagination literally generates an incorporeal being which acts back upon the physical body to sate those improper sexual desires. Such entities also explain the demonic beings that are said to copulate with people like witches and even generate monstrous children with them, specifically via semen stolen from such imaginative people. This is surprisingly close, by the way, to the way that Kabbalah imagines how literal semen demons are generated. So there's that. He also mentions that such blockages in the imagination can also cause erectile dysfunction. Again, very medieval, then all of a sudden very modern sounding. But yes, he does have a cure for metaphysically induced imagination-driven erectile dysfunction that I'll talk about in a minute, because I think the history of it is it's pretty funny. So how do you prevent your imagination from producing sex demons? is exactly the kind of question we would ask here at Esoterica. Well, the answer is chastity, both spiritual and mental chastity, but also the regular boring kind. But as St. Paul recommends at 1 Corinthians 7, for those people who burn with passion, well, they should just get married and copulate as necessary, to avoid producing more demons. Such children born out of such powerful libidinal imaginations, by the way, combined with good old-fashioned Christian love, tend, by the way, to be healthy and most happy, Paracelsus tells us. So you can shtup, you just gotta shtup appropriately. Chapter 4 of this text is a bit of a tangled mess, to be honest. Specifically, Paracelsus is at pains to treat the question of the efficacy of a specific form of magic, which is just generally punted to the next chapter. But more specifically, he rails against the alleged magnetic or sometimes healing power of the corpses of saints, a power that he attributes to the founding of everything from pagan religions to the success of both Islam and the Knights Templar, all of which he thinks are barbaric and evil. The question then is twofold. Why do some human bodies not decay? And more importantly, why are people so attracted and even seemingly cured by just such undecayed bodies? Now, to get at why this is, Paracelsus posits that from the primordial limbus, this is his term for the substrate of all living matter, there is a metaphysical propensity not only for growth, but also that which resists decay and even heals. This is part of the same force. This metaphysical property exists within all living beings, of course, but it can be especially found within the human body. And it's the force that causes us to grow, but also the one that, again, resists decay and ultimately cures us. It's what's literally causing you to heal when you get a cut or you're on your arm or something. But this property can also endure even after the physical body has died. And while the body is no longer growing, this property continues to resist decay. And you can probably guess what Paracelsus names this metaphysical property. He calls it Mummia. Yeah, like from mummy. In fact, mummies are going to be a big part of Paracelsian medicine, as we'll see. Certain bodies, he suggests, for a range of reasons he doesn't seem terribly confident about, seem to contain more of this Mummia and thus seemingly don't decay at all, leading to the so-called incorruptible bodies of the saints. But, as Paracelsus notes, not every saint is incorruptible, and even the bodies of known criminals and villains are known to be strongly resistant to decay for centuries. They become mummies. So it's not the specific person that's causing this process, but the Mummia still active in their bodies after death. Further, this Mummia has two powers. One is that it is oddly attractive. The Mummia in our body is attracted by the principle of like to the strong Mummia in certain corpses. Hence why people are drawn to things like executions and graveyards and even like to gaze at the bodies of the dead. This also sets up for cults of the dead, which Paracelsus sees as the origins of basically all pagan religions. Secondly, Mummia is that which is just in principle that which, again, resists decay, but also has the power to heal living bodies. Thus, ill people visiting or even touching the Mummia of the dead are actually being healed by this metaphysical property latent in the corpse and not by any other force. But Paracelsus does note that such Mummia could be used for medicinal purposes at will, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the use of Mummia became a staple for Paracelsian medicine. This is known as medical cannibalism, whereby mummified human flesh was ground to a powder and ingested, often in potions, like wine potions, to treat a range of illnesses in the Paracelsian tradition. Now, of course, medical bitumen or Mummia were a tradition way prior to Paracelsus, but he certainly put wind into the sails of this idea with his very specific theory of Mummia as a metaphysical principle of decay resistance and, of course, by extension, of healing. Lastly, we come to what is honestly a rather shocking chapter in which Paracelsus deals with the question of the use of magic specifically using sigils and even conjuring spirits in the task of healing. To answer this question, he deals briefly with the question of why is it that sorcery, specifically conjuring spirits, is so heavily associated with the forces of Satan via necromancy and witchcraft. His answer is simply that occult forces, recall occult here just means hidden, that those occult forces have existed since the creation of the world. That world, by the way, is populated not only by corporeal visible creatures like you and I, but also for legions of angels and demons and spirits typically associated with planets and with the elements, all the incorporeal creatures. But over time, human interaction with occult forces and entities slowly diminished as people just lost knowledge of this art. I mean, it's not apparent that they're here until eventually it was almost exclusively the purview of demons and those who sought out the power of demons. However, such power did exist in the past, and Paracelsus loves using the example of Moses transforming the staff of Aaron into a snake, as is mentioned in the story in the Exodus. But Paracelsus goes a step further, to say the very least, and makes what must have been a positively scandalous suggestion at the time. That necromancers and witches have power is just beyond question. Of course they do. The question is, why aren't Christian doctors using those powers too? He compares this appropriation of magic to snatching the daggers out of the hands of those who seek to kill us. As he puts it, their weapons are our medicine. No matter from which quarter we receive help, it invariably comes from God. For God is the one who gives and lends life to our bodies, and there is no other God. If you should fall into a ditch and a murderer helps you out, he says, well, you get out, and you owe no thanks to the murderer. His program is hilarious and extremely Paracelsus. Rather than forbidding magic, conjuration of angels or spirits or using sigils, or even claiming that he's reforming magic a la Ficino and Agrippa, he just goes full throttle and suggests of using the tools of the devil against him. He even cribs Jesus in Luke 6. Blessed are those that hate you, because you can literally use the weapons of the devil against him. Just as we can burn by fire or drown in water, magic may be dangerous, but its powers cannot be denied. And he writes, therefore you should conclude that it is the salvation that comes from the hand of our enemies. Indeed, he even writes, if the devil himself brings us gold and silver, helps us or provides us medicine, or springs us out of jail, you should just anticipate that this was God's will all along. But isn't doing magic like conjuring demons a violation of God's law? I mean, doesn't the Bible literally forbid magic, like suffer not a witch to live? Yeah, sure it does. He admits that. But it also says not to work and heal on the Sabbath. And guess what Jesus did? The Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. All of that. Yeah, Paracelsus uses Jesus's own antinomian relationship with the rules of the Old Testament to argue that the laws against sorcery and witchcraft and divination, etc., can and should be broken by a good Christian in the interest of healing, medicine, and combating the devil more generally. Why? Because as he puts it, because suffering should be alleviated with whatever means that are available, be they the devil, a spirit, a physician, a murderer, or whatever else is readily available. But what about those blasphemous ceremonies that are required to summon spirits and demons and perform magic? Well, those just aren't needed for Paracelsus. In fact, that's just window dressing made up by the devil and demons to trick people, to make people believe that devils and demons have power. Recall, it's the power of faith and imagination. That and that alone is needed. The rest is just distractions at best and idolatry at worst. Recall, he reminds us, that Moses had just a staff, just a stick, that he brought upon the plagues to Egypt and split the Red Sea, and Jesus himself, the Son of God, just used mud to heal the eyes of the blind. Indeed, he even suggests that we need to get busy summoning spirits because the devil and his allies have had a huge start. we are playing catch up. Thus, not only can we summon spirits, we need to be on that like yesterday. Doctors need to be summoning spirits now. But of course, not all spirits are good or useful. Paracelsus reminds us that in 1 John 4 that believers should test the spirits. Well, how else can you test them to see which ones are good and useful if you're not invoking them? Of course, Paracelsus warns about the dangers and the limits of magic. It only works via divine power. Spirits can and often are deceptive. Demons are very powerful and dangerous. And very rarely can you do something purely impossible. But it's a tool that should be in the toolkit of all doctors and alchemists. And like any powerful tool, it should be treated with careful respect. But why fight the forces of sickness and Satan with one arm tied behind your back, not using magic? Paracelsus says, get to using that magic. And as you can imagine, with such a mercenary attitude like that toward practices of magic, such practices were quickly adapted and even more so associated with Paracelsian medicine more generally. So much so that entire grimoires were attributed to Paracelsus and attached to his earliest collections in his big complete works. There are several grimoires in that big, huge Paracelsus volume that I just showed you. Though the editors included them, they were doubtful that Paracelsus himself ever wrote them. Perhaps my favorite such magical device associated with Paracelsus is his famed magical trident, made from a horseshoe and engraved with sigils on the day of Venus and in the hour of Saturn. This device was then hidden in a brook or a stream, whereby it caused the magical curse to fall back upon the witch or the sorcerer that induced it. That curse? Erectile dysfunction. Of course, I told you I'll come back to it in just a minute. Now, for reasons that I don't really understand, Eliphas Levi said that the trident actually represented the Christian Trinity and the tria prima of Paracelsian alchemy, salt, sulfur, and mercury, and he called it the trident of exorcism. And this interpretation has basically emerged triumphant, with said tridents, probably not made from horseshoes, for sale on websites like Etsy right now. I think I even saw a guy on Instagram about he was going to use this trident as one of the most powerful of all magical weapons, the most potent of magical weapons, which I guess is kind of true. I really just love how the game of telephone works when it comes to magical texts, that it goes from being something to treat erectile dysfunction to being a magical weapon on Instagram. And with his discussion on magic and alchemy, that brings the Paramirum to a close, the early and most programmatic text of Paracelsus. Of course, this is by no means exhaustive of the works of Paracelsus. I have to remind you that he was only second to Martin Luther as the most prolific German author of the 16th century. I mean, again, the Paramirum only takes up about 40 pages of this monstrosity, and we have tons of cosmological, medical, and speculative works to cover. Also, I want to come back to his text on the matrix, not the matrix, the womb, especially because of how his analysis of pregnancy is deeply tied to his hermetic cosmology. But the vast amount written by Paracelsus is just sadly not at all represented in available, reliable English translations. But for a brief biography, I'd consult Moran's Paracelsus and Alchemical Life, and Moran has lots of other great books on alchemy. They're all worthwhile checking out. Nicholas Goodrick Clark has prepared a brief selection of texts by Paracelsus that are pretty reliable. However, I will say that the 2-volume A.E. Waite edition of Hermetic and Alchemical writings of Paracelsus just isn't really reliable. But the good news and the bad news is that a very reliable edition of the Paragranum and the Paramirum by Andrew Weeks does exist, and it's published by Brill, and it costs like $400 for some reason, though I think it's now out of print, so both out of print and Brill prices in this economy, good luck with that. Maybe Paracelsus should have a trident for that. More content to come on Paracelsus. I just love this stuff so much. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.